How you doing, all right? You're like a couple of teenagers, you two. You're like teenagers.
Is this ready? Because he said, do you want to say you're okay now?
It's on. Should be going live any second. It says it's live, must be live. There's nobody watching yet, but they'll be on soon.
Okay.
You should see a couple of people come on there. So,
or did you cancel it? Did you cancel the live?
it's not cancelled.
You didn't cancel it.
That's running, no? Yeah, look, we've got people there. There we go. So we're in the speaker's corner. Nice sunny afternoon, but a bit cold quite soon, so must beware. Got my bottle of water. Yes, I'm late because I took my son for lunch. At a Uyghur restaurant in Great Russell Street, which I highly recommend. So that's that bit out of the way. It's quite noisy now, isn't it? Far away.
Mr. Speaker, what's the correct level of taxation?
I'm going to move back because the sound is now getting quite noisy.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm going to drag you into a corner over here because that is quite noisy here. There we go. A gentleman asked me what's the correct level of taxation. There isn't one. Taxation in general, however, in my opinion, should be progressive, and that means that the wealthiest people should pay more taxation and the poorer people pay no taxation. So that's the general framework that I would argue about taxation in personal income. Then the decisive question in terms of revenue generation is the taxation of corporations and corporate profits, which of course is another question altogether, but generally that's about the scale. The larger the scale, the more the taxation should be used as a source of transferring wealth to the mass of the people. And the smaller companies, in my belief, should be largely excluded from taxation. So it's really a progressive scale of taxation.
So to set fiscal policy, how would you set fiscal policy? What's the actual? What taxes should be given? What taxes should be taken? What should be given out? And what should it be spent on?
Firstly, I believe that the largest companies in the country, the continent, and the world should be publicly owned. So by that I mean the top 100, 150 companies in Britain, the top 1,000, 2,000 companies in the world. They should be publicly owned and subject to democratic control. And in this case, the structure of taxation needs to be designed around policy objectives. So there are many ways to tax things. For example, in the Soviet Union, early Soviet Union, for example, they introduced taxation, which was, for example, on train transport. So you're transporting goods around the country. And on one section, for example, certain types of private companies, they would charge a higher rate for using those trains, the train carriages, than they would do for a cooperative farm, for example. So you can structure taxation depending upon the exigencies and needs of the government or the people at the time. So that's it's a broad, rough, sweeping outline. Taxation is a mechanism of transferring resources from those who've got more than enough towards the purposes and objectives of state policy controlled by the people. So that's how I'd see that.
Are windfall taxes on the oil producers a good thing or not? Windfall taxes on the profits that they make?
Windfall taxes in general can be beneficial if they, again, you have to weigh it up. You know, is it serving the purposes and needs of the population? Well, if at a particular time, like now, where the price of energy has been skyrocketing, and the excuse is given that the Russians are to blame with that, which is completely false, then yes, you can say we will nationalise, you will either nationalise energy companies, or you will place a windfall tax on them and grab resources from them. It's basically a source of expropriation of resources. One could be, they could be legal expropriation. In Germany, they just expropriated, Russian oil companies, oil and gas companies. So there's nothing prohibited about nationalisation or expropriation. It's something that's done even in the most developed capitalist countries. At the time of the 2008 economic crash, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, one of the largest mortgage holders, or the largest mortgage holder in the United States, was nationalised by the government. And so, there's no anathema, there should be no anathema saying we will grab resources and we will do it in this way. So that's...
Is MT Morgan nationalized, the American? Is it nationalized? The mortgage company?
Well, Fannie Mac and Freddie Mae were effectively nationalised. I don't know whether they still are, but they were at that time.
They've been bailed out, yes.
I think they were nationalised, taken into public ownership and used for the purposes of resolving the problem. Of course, we have the same problem now. You're going to have skyrocketing mortgage rates compared with before. So people are on 2% or 3% now. In a year, 2 years, many of them will be on, I think it's 100,000 or 200,000 per year over the next year or two. They will be on jumping from 2 or 3% interest rates to 5 or 6% or more. So it'll be a sharp shock for the mortgage market, which almost certainly means a crash in the housing market. Now, because of the structure of the economy, the way in which significant numbers of the population are tied into mortgages, that will cause a collapse in their living standards. But there's a generalised collapse. Don't forget, they took from the world's population huge resources in the name of fighting the pandemic. Then after this, they need to recuperate these resources. Now, part of the money went to the most wealthy people in the world. The largest 20 companies doubled their income. The largest or the wealthiest 50 to 100 people multiplied their income by many times. For example, Elon Musk saw his personal wealth rise from 25 billion to 225 billion in the last couple of years. And therefore, there also needs to be some revenue, some means to ensure that the population pay for this transfer of wealth to the wealthiest and for the debts accumulated during the pandemic. And the way they're doing that is what they're doing now. A huge assault on the living standards of the people all across the world. 350 million people pushed to the edge of starvation. And even in the most advanced, tells you everything, in the most advanced capitalist countries, Britain, America, Germany and so on, living standards of the majority, or better said, of the lower third, are falling in the wealthiest countries in the world. Well, if that's happening in the wealthiest countries in the world, ask yourself what's happening in Egypt, in India, in sub-Saharan Africa, in South America, in the favela. 35 million people. They wonder about Lula's vote at the last weekend. 35 million people pushed to the edge of hunger in Brazil, in a country that produces enough food, hunger that is, 35 million. Brazil produces food for 1 billion people on earth. So there's no possible reason for this except policy. It's deliberate policy to drive down the living standards of the workers. There are people, and there always have been people, who advocate depopulation, Malthusian policies and so on. Malthus was working his ideas out in the early 19th century. Argued you depopulate, control the world's population, control the world as it is. But of course it destroys the goose that lays the golden egg. Surplus accumulated from the unpaid labour power of the working class comes, only from enlarging the population rather than reducing the population. So I don't think Malthusian policies will be adopted universally, simply because it destroys the goose that lays the golden egg. The egg comes from living labour, from living human beings. The more you're exploiting, the more you get. So for that reason, I don't think even though there are powerful people advocating Malthusian population control, I don't think they will ultimately gain the upper hand, because the overwhelming weight of capitalism is to exploit living labour. The more you've got, the more profit you get, the more surplus you can get. But it can of course cause problems. If you've got 300 million poor people, well, of course if in theory you could annihilate them overnight, then you might be able at that moment to stabilize the society. But of course, wealth is a relative thing. If I live in a shack and next door to me, yes please, thank you. Just milk, no sugar, thank you very much. If I live in a shack and next to me someone lives in a small little one-bedroom flat, then I feel poor relative to them, but I don't feel so poor. It's not such a vast gap. If on the other side, I live in a shack or I live in the two-bedroom apartment and next to me is a huge mansion, then of course, relative to that position, I feel far worse off. So, and then the other side to it is, if you annihilate a significant section of the population, you then create a labour shortage. To some degree, we have a labour shortage now. You have a labour shortage. The labour shortage strengthens the power of the workers, so they're able to demand higher wages, better conditions. So, you know, there is no Malthusian solution to this, even though some people might think there is.
Should all borders be thrown open? Should there be no borders to countries?
I mean, as a general principle, I believe passports and borders are an anachronism and should be moved to remove them. But given the real circumstances we live in, I fully understand the concerns that people have about people arriving on our shores with our country and our taxes and our welfare system, to be worried about more people coming in. Of course, I understand that sentiment, but my general argument is the world is extremely wealthy, produces enormous amount of wealth, is easily able to feed, clothe and house and educate the world's population, and you should start out therefore from that simple fact before you attempt to suggest that, oh, a border is needed to stop that person coming in, because it won't really fundamentally make any difference. The world economy has a world division of labour, and that world division of labour is organised for productive purposes. Therefore, the idea that a few people extra here, a few people extra there is going to make a significant difference to things, I don't think is true.
But, I mean, surely you accept that mass immigration has been used specifically to just attack societies.
Sometimes.
You know, it's like, I mean, small villages, you know, a few hundred households are being sort of like dumped with like, you know, massive numbers of overwhelmingly men or entirely men from other
I'm saying,
countries.
I understand the sentiments driven by those circumstances, or better said, driven by the economic contradiction which is driving people to move away from where they live and seek a better life, and on the other side, that is making people scared that they're being encroached upon by aliens from another world.
But it's been done deliberately.
On the other side, well, whether it's done deliberately, there is nothing new in this. Nothing. During periods of economic growth, for example, 1990 to 2000, not all growth, but anyway, 1990 to 2010, there was a huge wave of immigration into Britain. But there wasn't so much tension as there is now around these questions. So the issue is, America is a country built on immigration, and therefore there's been no problem there. Now, if you want to know whether immigration per se causes this problem, you look at China. In China, we've seen over the last 40 years the greatest migration of human history from the countryside to the cities. And to believe that the people of Poland moving to England are any less different than the people from the villages in China moving to the cities in China is incorrect. There's a vast difference in the mindset, in the behaviour, in the outlook, in the history, in the culture and traditions of the rural population in China and the urban. And yet, this has been the largest migration in human history in our time, almost entirely peacefully. So it's not true to say that this immigration... Sorry?
I bet the people who have been forced off the land don't really like being urbanised, because that's what they want to do here as well.
The assumption is they're forced off the land. Most of them aren't forced off the land. Most of them leave the land voluntarily, because for them it's 2,000 years of history.
Economic necessity.
Well, it's not just economic necessity. A pool It's not simply necessity. If you want to earn more money and you want to enter the modern world, and your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and so on, going back through the ages, that's not necessarily necessity. In fact, the grandparents might turn around and say, stay on the land, live with us, you'll be okay. But they don't want to do that. They want to move to the cities, just the same as many people from, I don't know, Barnsley want to move to London or to Leeds or to Manchester. It's not necessarily forced off the countryside, it's a drive, an impulse, which human beings all experience. It's not exclusively that, but it's largely that. Most of the migration in those, both in Europe in the last 30 years and in China in the last 40 years, most of that's voluntary migration. But it's also true that this creates antagonism there. For example, in Tibet, there were waves of conflict in Tibet. Why did Tibet enter conflict? Because Tibet is a large area of land with a small population, which have long, thousands of years of traditions, and then along come an immigration wave of Han Chinese, who now dominate the population in Tibet. And they get all the best jobs. Why do they get the best jobs? Because if you need an engineer in Tibet to build a high-speed rail line, and you put out an advert, engineer to build high-speed rail line, sought. Thank you. What do you find? You get a CV from 6,000 Han Chinese, and you get a CV from 3 Tibetans. So, what's the likelihood? The likelihood is you will swamp the Tibetans out of the best jobs. So it is also, by the way, a lot of people talk about the Uyghurs and the Muslims in Xinjiang in Western China. That is what happened in Western China as well. And that's why there is an anti-Chinese sentiment amongst a section of the Uyghurs, which of course manifests itself in their cultural context in Islamic fundamentalism, or amongst a section of them. And then of course the Han Chinese and the Chinese government use that as an excuse to contain the Uyghurs.
That's a gentle way of putting it.
Well, it is contained. The idea that they've got concentration camps and so on, that they're propagating it, it's a lie.
Is it?
It's a lie. It's a lie. They do, however, as in the rest of China, as part of their policy of urbanization, they do train people in what they consider to be the mores and norms of modern cultural life in China. So, for example, if you're a peasant and you're offered employment in a factory in Shenzhen, and you move from the countryside, you've been recruited by recruiting gangs. They got 3,000 of you moving from a village in Gansu province, and you're then given a job in a factory. They're going to train you to do that job in the factory, which is operating, for example, to make, I don't know, Huawei mobile phones. You've never worked in a factory before, you lived on the land. What do? They take them into special training. They give them training, they give them language training, give computer training, they put them in barrack-like accommodation. Those barracks are relatively sealed off from the rest of the population, and it's a very similar process in Xinjiang. I'm not saying there are no places where people are detained illegally or wrongly, but the idea there are millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps, I think, is a fictitious invention by the West. It's an invention.
Should we rejoin the European Union?
I don't think we should rejoin the European Union, no. I mean, given the fact we've left, given the fact that there was enormous contentious conflict around this issue when it happened, given the fact it didn't actually do anything, because after all, it was all about, for me, it was about free movement. And yes, it's a pain in the arse now. You go and travel abroad, you have to get stamped and all the rest of it. But on the other side, don't forget, during the last 2.5 years, the delusion that the European Union is a single integrated whole and anyone can move where they went out the window. You couldn't even leave your bloody home in France or Spain or Germany. And in Austria, they said, if you're not vaccinated, we can lock you up for a year in prison if you don't pay the fine that we'll allocate to you because you leave home without a vaccine in your arm. And so the idea that the European Union represents free movement is obviously false. That idea collapsed during the pandemic and never, well, they make out it's restored now, but in actual fact it's not restored. The fact that they were able to do this in direct breach of their own supposed agreements illustrates that it was all just a lot of bullshit. Free movement, free people, free association, complete nonsense. We had imposed on Europe in the last 2.5 years the most stringent dictatorial regime that has ever existed across the whole continent of Europe. And so, the idea that this is, that the European Union represents something progressive is a delusion. Look now they're trying to whip us all up into hatred against the Russians over the conflict in Ukraine. And of course they ban people from YouTube, they prevent people from discussing the issue, and they want to make out we are all fighting a war at home when we turn on the electric or the gas. We're all fighting a war against Putin in Russia. That's what they want to tell you, that we're fighting against the Russians, and we're fighting the just cause for freedom and democracy. At the time when the war began in Ukraine, we had only just or about to come out of lockdown. In fact, the first indicator that we're about to come out of lockdown was that no one could come to England without a vaccination, I believe, or a PCR test, until the 19th of February this year. Then suddenly there was a change on the website of the government which said anyone from Ukraine can come to England without a PCR test. That's when you knew the game was going up, and we were changing gear from pandemic to war-demic. One to the other, shift pattern, shift direction. Both, by the way, are dampers on demand. The destruction of small businesses and the consequences of lockdown were to dampen down the economy, and the same process here. War, who wants to go and buy and spend during a war? It's hardly the great. You could spend on weapons, invest in the arms industry, you might make some money out of that. Occasional speculation on prices of commodities, you might make money on that. Wheat goes up, corn goes up, things like that. But otherwise, the idea that this is a period of great prosperity, they are deliberately crashing the economy. Here, in Germany, in America, and of course the aim is to defeat their enemies. The imperial game by the Americans.
Right.
Led by the Americans. They're the number one power. They're the number one power, so they act according to their own interests. What are their interests? To smash Europe, smash Russia, and eventually smash China. That's
right.
The interest. That's the objective. Those are the long-term strategic objectives of the United States of America. And of course, Britain is in bed with the Americans. So the aim is to ultimately smash the Chinese. That's the real objective, because they're the only serious threat to America. It's the only serious threat. So the Russians are a show. Sorry.
They're the ones that they owe all their money to.
Well,
Keep massively in debt to China.
well, they may be in debt to
They
China.
don't pay it back.
Yes, but don't forget they've got the big guns.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
America's always had the guns. So whether America's in debt is not the decisive issue, because America can always tell us, how much do I owe you? Can we renegotiate? That's the game. Ukraine is in massive debt. Massive debts. The country that we are in love with, that we protect, that we save, the people who we protect. They're not protecting them, they're taking over the country. Ukraine has been taken over economically in the last 5 months. Since the war began, Western powers bought up the resources in Ukraine, awaiting the end of the war, when they will have then control of the grain supplies which dominate the world. And then you think they'll supply that grain for cheap to the world? No! They will have a monopoly on the supply of grain to the world. They increase the prices, drive down the living standards elsewhere, then invest in those countries that collapse, so on and so forth. That's the game. Right back, you look back. I was looking at this myself, looking through the newspapers from the 1850s, when the Crimean War was going on. Exactly the same crisis we have today. Exactly the same. Turkey, Russia, Britain, France, all involved in Ukraine, or in the Crimean area. To pretend this is anything different than a great power game to control the resources of the world would be utterly foolish. Anyone who believes this is about morality and freedom is an ignoramus.
Bullshit.
That's never been what these wars are about. Never.
Yeah.
They never will be, to be honest with you. Never. When have we fought a just moral war?
Never.
When?
Never.
The Falklands War, the Iraq War, the Afghan War, the Syrian War, the war against the Mau Mau. The Second World War, was it a moral war?
No.
It wasn't a moral war.
No.
Adolf Hitler wanted to challenge the might of Britain. Britain had a fifth of the world under its dominance. In fact, Hitler at the end, you know what he said? He said we should have mobilized the Muslims against the British Empire. He thought if he beats Russia, then he can make a deal with the Brits and divide the world. That was the idea that Adolf Hitler had. He was mistaken. He had King, what was his name? King George, what was his name? The guy who got married to the American heiress. What's it? Edward, isn't it? King Edward VIII, I think it is. Is that right? King Edward what? King George, the one who was with Edward and Mrs. Simpson.
Yeah, I did Mrs.
Edward. He said anyway. King Edward. King Edward was an ally of Hitler. That's why they've got pictures of the Queen doing the Nazi salute, because Hitler was all in the royal family. Sorry? Yes, the Germans, the German family. So, because Hitler, or better said, because the King of England was in with Adolf Hitler, so you know what Hitler wanted? He wanted to do. They made him the governor of Bermuda. And Hitler said, if we invade England and we conquer England, we'll bring Edward back and put him on the throne. He can be Hitler's representative in England. So the ruling classes in England were intimately associated with Adolf Hitler. The idea that they were enemies is a farce. As you said, the German Royal, they only changed their name from Saxe-Coburg in 1917 during the First World War. When the Russian Revolution happened, they feared revolution might spread to England. So we need to change the identity of the English ruling elite from a German elite to an English, a national elite, you know. Everything is a hullabaloo creation to shift the mind of the masses, to stupefy people,
That's
you know.
right,
That's
right.
why we had
Yeah.
this magnificent celebration a couple of weeks ago of the Queen's death. And I was perplexed when the Queen died. I must say this, because now they at the time I said, you may remember, I said, I wonder what the Queen died of. And they didn't say. Whenever I asked people, what did the Queen die of? I even asked a friend of mine who's a member of the royal family. So what did the Queen die of? He said, they won't tell me. So then I said, what did the Queen die of? What did the Queen die of? And then last week they published something. After the whole story was over, they published something after she was dead and buried, by the way. Suddenly the doctor releases the paper and says, died of old age. Now, in case you didn't know, look up on the government website. Doctors are not allowed to say someone died of old age, except in exceptional circumstances. So the question I asked was this: did they give the Queen the booster? Right? Because she died very quickly. And for sure, if she'd been given the booster, she wouldn't have died quickly. Because the booster protects lives, saves everyone, and no one's ever been harmed by an injection, according to YouTube.
Here, here.
And we must all abide by what YouTube says.
That's right.
Because they're the only ones who know the truth
Damn
about
right.
medical questions. How else could you know what the truth is unless you relied upon the internet and social media to tell you when you said the wrong thing? To be fair to the Chinese, at least when they're lied to by the government, they know they're being lied to. Whereas in Britain, when we're lied to systematically by the government, the mass media, social media, most people think they're telling the truth. We're being attacked by enemies of the truth, you know. Piers Corbyn and his entourage are destroying truth on earth. That's what they told you for a couple of years. And of course, who am I to challenge such a coherent story? But where's Chris Whitty gone? Where's Patrick Van Dam? Where's who's the other guy? Patrick Vallance. Where are they now? The guys who used to come on telly and tell you to stay at home for 2 years.
Don't
Tell you to
kill
stay locked
grandma.
up. Tell you not to wear a fucking mask on the tube, telling you wash your hands all the time, which are marvellous recommendations, by the way. Everyone should wash their hands right now. Keep it 2 minutes. Don't forget, there is more coronavirus in Britain today.
There's no coronavirus. Shut up.
There's more coronavirus in Britain. The
There's
gentleman
no
wants to argue.
coronavirus.
According,
There's no coronavirus.
well, you are saying there's no coronavirus.
Mate. You was at the debate the other day with
I
Piers.
made
I
my
want
point of
some
view.
George,
He's explaining. George,
Debate this question. I don't have a problem with
We will
debate.
debate
I
you.
never have had a problem.
Yes, you have. You ain't going to the book parade. You don't lie.
What's
I'm fed up with your lies, mate.
What did you say?
We're talking privately, mate.
No, you
We're
want to
talking
shout it out
privately.
here. We've had discussions before.
No, we
The
ain't. You
gentleman-
never listen to me. You always say, oh, there's a virus, there's a virus.
No,
There's
no.
virus,
What happened
mate.
was you came up to my meetings, interrupted my meetings in the middle of my meeting, shouting and screaming at me, and I said, look, I'm happy to show you how to speak at Speaker's Corner, express your
Don't
point of
patch up with
view,
me how
say
to
what
speak
you
at
think.
Speaker's Corner.
What
Speak, mate.
you're
I heckle, I just
saying,
wanna say
what
what I
you're
want.
saying
There's no way to do
is
it.
that
No right
I
or
should
wrong, mate.
say what you think.
No, say the fucking truth, you
You
can't.
think it's
say
the
the
truth.
truth. Is the fucking
I
truth.
swear at you.
I'm telling you it's the
Am I
truth.
swearing at you?
I swear at you, 'cause you're a
Why are
fucking
you-
liar. And you comment,
does it make
and
me
we
a
don't
liar?
trust you.
Because I
Fuck
don't
off,
agree
talking
with
shit.
you does not make
Fuck
me a
off,
liar.
yes, you are a liar.
Why am I a liar?
You're a liar because you ain't facing the truth and you've had it for fucking
No.
ages.
You
Fuck
think
off.
that's the truth.
It is the
right?
truth.
I don't
Show
think
us
it's the
where
truth.
real, then.
But I'm
show
not.
us where it's real. You can't. There's no evidence there to show it's real.
Well, you know very well, I
Fucking
spoke
liar.
on this question. What he's talking about is he thinks,
Bioterrain field, there's no virus to catch.
that's what he thinks, right? He says,
That's what I
there
fucking
are
know,
no...
mate.
Well, that's what you think.
That's what I know. Well, you think it's real. Where's your evidence, mate?
I've expressed myself, you could have listened to what I said.
I
at
can't
that
listen to
meeting.
shit. I can't listen to it. It goes in there and out there. Rather than talk to him.
Well, then that's
you
not,
talk
that's
shit,
not,
mate.
You could, listen. You
He's
could be
nice guy.
1,000% right on
He's a
something
fucking liar. Talk shit.
and not be able to argue your case, right? You could be 1,000% right on something and not be able to argue your case. I could be 1,000% wrong on something and be able to argue my case.
Yeah, because you're fucking
No, I put
lying.
it to
you.
you.
Talk shit, mate.
Well, how does that make me a liar?
Because you're
I would,
the
if
business,
I
you don't
believed
fucking look at the
what
evidence
you're
in front of
saying,
you.
if I believed what you're saying was correct, and instead of that, I put forward the opposing view as my view, that would be a liar. To say what I think
you
and what I
still say viruses
believe,
are real, what
whether
you
it's
posted.
right or not,
They're not
is
real.
not a liar.
They're not
Right?
real.
Doesn't
There's
make me a
such
liar.
thing as asymptomatic
How does it make me a
transmission or
liar?
carrier.
Now,
Because
the
you're not
gentleman
facing
is
the truth,
saying-
you're lying. That's
The
what it
gentleman
means,
is-
mate.
it's not lying.
Of course it is.
You don't know what the definition of
Of
lying
course I
is.
do. When you don't tell the fucking truth.
No,
It's very
when you
simple,
know
mate.
something to be
I don't trust
untrue,
you, don't fucking
a
lie,
lie,
this is shit.
I don't
Hang on.
You are trying to catch me on a definitional question as to what a virus is, right? That's what you're trying to do. You're saying to me, Koch's postulates about isolating a virus have not been fulfilled,
Correct.
and therefore viruses don't exist. Now, I know this is an argument. I discussed this argument a couple of days ago. I gave my point of view. I explained what that point of view is. If I, however, was to adopt your point of view, without actually studying it to the degree
You've had
where
plenty of time to study it.
I was
How many times
satisfied
have I read this
that
fucking
that
book?
argument
How many
was
times
correct.
I've offered you
I've
that
never
book?
read that book.
Because you fucking don't want to. You're not allowed to, you little shield.
Allowed.
Fucking God. You're not allowed to. We know what you're about.
So the question I'm asking you is this.
The main thing, the
You're
real
saying to
truth,
me-
people know you're fucking liar.
Ah, blow up. You see, that's the level of it. Now, I know there are plenty of people. Why don't you just engage with the argument instead of screaming and shouting, get freaked out and swearing at me? What's that? I ain't talking to you for swearing at me like this. Grow up. Grow up. And that's going to be resolved like this, is it? It's going to be resolved like this. Well, I mean, you know, it's not unusual for people to get het up and say, George there has got het up with me from the beginning about this. Fine, I don't have any problem. You got one point of view, I've got another point of view. In the process of discussing ideas and putting forward the counterposed views, people can advance their understanding and ideas. Now, I'm not even adverse to the theories, but I'm not convinced by them. And therefore, I'm not going to stand up here and say I am. If I was to stand up here and say I'm convinced by those ideas, I would be a liar, right? So that's what the issue is, and he's telling me the characterization must be determined by Koch's postulates, or it's a lie. Well, I'm saying, well, the definition of a lie is that. If I was to argue for something I don't believe in, and say that's correct, that would
But
be
he's
right.
saying he showed you evidence. He's trying to show you a book and you don't want to read it, is what he's saying.
Look, there are plenty of books in the world.
Yeah.
I went to the meeting where that guy spoke, the guy who was the author of the book.
It's by Don Lester,
Yes.
what really makes you know. We know what it is.
I went to the
I
meeting
got
where
the
that
book,
guy
I bought
spoke.
it.
I didn't find his arguments convincing.
I was there that day, yeah.
I've watched the discussions by Sam Bailey, by Kaufman, by Kernline and so on YouTube. I've had a skim of Virus Mania. I'm not convinced. That's it. I'm not convinced.
But like everything in life,
Could I be convinced if I really went into depth and I found the arguments overwhelming?
Listen,
Yes.
listen.
But at the
I'm using
moment,
the same
I'm not
method.
but hold on a
convinced.
minute, let me just say, with
I'm
everything
using
in
the
life,
same method. I'm
we
not-
all
I'm
get
not-
our
I'm
sources
not-
of information,
No.
and when we research from different places. So what he's saying and what all of us say, when we read things, we have to cross-check it, and then sometimes let me just
I don't
say,
have any problem
the
with
evidence that comes up is normally something now what we satisfy ourselves in saying we believe more. That's the truth. So again, he's got his own belief on what he's read, and you have got yours. That's exactly what's
Yes,
happening.
exactly. But then there's the question at Speaker's Corner, or in any debate, of how you engage in an argument. If you, as I said, you could be 1,000% right and be capable of making a coherent argument. You could be 1,000% wrong and argue a case magnificently.
So it's stalemate. It
How
ends up being
else do you
stalemate.
have? Well, I don't have to. I'm not determined to make it stalemate. I'm prepared to engage with people who I disagree with, and I'm prepared to move if I find their arguments overwhelmingly convincing. But at the moment, I don't. So I'm not going to turn around and try and drag the audience into a direction which I don't believe in. Why should I do that? It would be dishonest. It would be foolish.
Maybe on his side, you think you're not trying hard enough
Well,
to see his.
basically, there's a Marxist theory by the name of Gramsci, and what he said was, most people in the world, we know this in the last 2 years, most people in the world go along with the story they're told.
That's right.
If
That's
they
right.
think people are authorities on the thing.
That's right.
So if you've got a scientist or a professor or an expert
someone with a
who
title,
tells
yeah.
you something's true,
Yeah.
most people will look at those people, they'll look a little bit skeptical, and then they'll say, oh, I think they're probably telling the truth.
Yeah.
And if you question them about that,
Yeah.
then they'll probably say, well, what do you know about it?
Yeah.
Are you a scientist? Are you a virologist?
Yeah.
Are you an expert?
Yeah. I have a friend. Listen.
And you may or may not be, but the point being then is that even if you are an expert, George thinks he's an expert on this theme, even if he's an expert on the theme, and he's recognised as an expert and he's leaning, he's not adopting this position because he thought it up himself, he's adopting it because he's heard other people say it, and he's read other people say it, and he's convinced by what they said. So in other words, you have authority here, authority there, and underneath them, you have large numbers of people who accept their ideas without necessarily having engaged in the necessary discussions and arguments that formulated their own arguments. So you're relying upon authority, right? Now I do the same. Of course I do. I'm not denying it.
right.
I explained this at the meeting the other day. During the discussion on the pandemic, I relied upon two people who I thought were the most convincing. One is by the name Professor Sukhari Bhakti from Germany, and the other was Wolfgang Wodark from Germany as well. And I followed the discussions in the whole of the pandemic period, and I thought they made the most convincing and coherent arguments. Now, I
Some
have
people talk a good game.
have heard people from the other point of view, from this non-viral point of view, what they call terrain theory and so on. And by the way, Karl Marx subscribed to that theory, but it was earlier than most of the writings about germ theory and so on. And I'm agnostic on that question, but I'm certainly convinced that you can destroy all the arguments of the existing order more coherently by explaining arguments within the parameters of germ theory than you can by saying it's a lot of nonsense.
Just to say.
But that doesn't mean it's not.
But
It
wait,
might
just
be.
to say what you said again. When people have a title, more people subscribe and believe what these people say because they come from an authoritative,
Yeah, we have an
part where
we have
they
a,
believe
we have
they
a
talk a good
religion
game.
of science today.
Yeah. That's
where
what-
we've been
that's the
told
problem in
the
this
scientists
world, though.
know
People
about
are very
climate
gullible,
change,
they start
the
believing
scientists know
people
about
You think they know
viruses,
more.
the scientists know about pandemics, and the scientists, by the way, know about economics, and that's how you can tell that it's not a bullshit. Because surely if the greatest scientists in the world invested into or researchers in the world invested in studies on economics can't work out a way to make the economy grow and help the people of the world, well, there must be something wrong with the general research and analysis dynamics in the world. I don't deny that either. But I don't think it
I think what we all need to admit as well, I think everybody in this world we live in, we're all confused to a certain extent. But some people's ego and arrogance doesn't like to admit that. I got a friend, he's a university lecturer, and when me and him talk, his attitude is always to say what he's saying to me is right because he's a lecturer. But there's so much times I've caught him out.
I mean, look here. Speaker's Corner could not exist if it was entirely dependent on proof. Right? People here are standing here, they're religious. A lot of people are religious speakers. Well, whether it's ego or not, they believe there is some supernatural being driving humanity's fate. That's what most of the religious speakers believe in. And that there is some moral order that represents that God or that supernatural being. You can engage in a discussion with them till you're blue in the face for 40 years on end. You'll never convince them of your point of view. So, you know, it's not any different in principle with many other questions. Some issues you can resolve by a simple argument, but most people are not prepared to engage in an argument in any case.
We're always going to get frustrated.
You know, what are barristers and what is the law? The law is a framework for organising society based on economic and political interest and historical background. Then the barristers appear in front of the courts and present all the cases in history to try and out-argue each other. Right. And they resolve the case by argument, not by fact, not by the detailed evidence and exposition they might pretend it is, but ultimately they're there convincing a judge or a jury of laymen of the dynamics of the argument. So within the parameters of that, I have my point of view. I'm not going to move on it because someone shouts at me or someone attacks me, or you know, some other people have been doing that at Speaker's Corner, you know, trying to undermine my economic existence and similar activities. Well, you know, I think that's a dishonest and despicable way to behave. What my point of view is neither here nor there. If you want to say something, get up at Speaker's Corner and say it yourself. You know, I don't have any problem with that. I'll train people and encourage them to do that. Same with anyone on the YouTube who wants to learn how to speak. I'll come up here. I don't care what your point of view is. I'll help you to get up and speak here and train you to speak. But I don't care what your viewpoint is. I'm encouraging free speech. So if I and other people disagree, so be it. Good. It would be utterly tedious to stand up here and agree with everyone. Nothing more boring, I assure you. Okay, any other questions or contributions from the audience? Yes.
Would you mind saying the rest of the Queen story? Because last week everyone was spoiling it about what your friend said, so I can record it again.
No, because I don't want... all I was saying was, if the Queen wasn't boosted, I wonder why. She was in the right age group, she was vulnerable, she should have been boosted. And had she been boosted, she'd probably be alive today. Might be alive today.
What do you mean boosted?
You know what I mean. Got a big booster.
I don't know what you mean. I have no idea what you mean.
Oh, well, never mind then.
What do you mean boosted?
I don't mean anything. I'm only joking. I'm joking. Boosted. Booster. You know booster? The booster?
Having the injection?
Yes.
It wasn't
No,
that
well,
part either.
we're all best off without it. We know that. We know what's in it.
No. The government says it's a good thing.
The
government says it's a good thing.
All of us who haven't, we're all well.
YouTube says it's a good thing. The government says it's a good thing. Just to juxtapose the argument you're making, because I don't want people to think that I'm advocating medical misinformation on YouTube. So the government says it's good, YouTube says it's good. Remember that, which means it probably is good for them. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'll call a halt. I understand the power's going anyway. Thanks very much for coming. Hope you enjoyed the meeting.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Heiko Khoo, thank you.